June 16, 1945, on the southern tip of Okinawa, a Marine private presses his back against jagged coral rock as Japanese machine gun fire rakes the ridge above him, and somewhere in the darkness of a cave just yards away, men who have already decided they will never surrender wait with grenades clutched against their chests, because this hill, this nameless, blood-soaked rise of stone called Yuza-Dake, sits at the very edge of the world Imperial Japan has left to defend, and by nightfall it will belong to the Americans, but the price paid for every yard of it will be measured in young men who will never go home. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific had narrowed to a single brutal equation. How many more islands, how many more lives, before Japan's home territory itself became the battlefield? Okinawa was the answer the Allies dreaded most, a Ryukyu island just 340 miles from Kyushu, large enough to host airfields and harbours that could support an invasion of Japan proper. On April 1, 1945, the United States 10th Army, under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., landed more than 60,000 soldiers and Marines on Okinawa's western beaches, expecting fierce resistance at the shore. Instead, they found nothing, because the Japanese 32nd Army under General Mitsuru Ushijima had abandoned the beaches entirely, withdrawing inland to a network of fortified ridgelines, caves and tunnels anchored around Shuri Castle, a strategy designed not to repel the invasion but to bleed it white, to inflict such staggering casualties that American resolve for an invasion of Japan itself might falter. For nearly 2 months, that strategy worked with horrifying precision. Names like Sugarloaf Hill, Kakuzu Ridge and Conical Hill became synonymous with the kind of fighting unlike anything seen earlier in the Pacific, men crawling forward through mud turned to soup by the worst rains in memory, flamethrowers burning into cave mouths, satchel charges sealing tombs that still held the living. Shuri Castle finally fell on May 29th, but Ushijima's army did not collapse, it simply retreated again, this time to the last defensible terrain on the island, a final line stretching across the southern tip of Okinawa, from Kunishi Ridge in the west through the linked heights of Yuza-Dake and Yuza-Dake in the east. A natural coral escarpment that rose like a fortress wall across roughly 6 miles of ground. The Japanese force that dug into this final line was a shadow of what had landed 2 months of combat ago, reduced to perhaps 30,000 men, only a third of them trained infantry, the rest cooks, clerks, labourers and Okinawan conscripts pressed into service as the Empire's last reserves on the island. Yet what they lacked in numbers and training, they made up for in the terrain itself, because the coral rock of Yuza-Dake and its sister peaks could not be dug into with ordinary entrenching tools. It had to be blasted, and the caves the Japanese had carved and reinforced inside it created interlocking fields of fire that turned every approach into a killing ground. American troops nicknamed the neighbouring height Yuza-Dake, the Big Apple, for its rounded shape. But there was nothing sweet about it. Every yard gained meant Marines and soldiers exposed on open coral with no cover, climbing toward enemy guns that had been sighted in for weeks. The advance through early June was agonizingly slow. Tanks could not maneuver across the soft clay, left by weeks of rain, and supplies sometimes had to be dropped by air. 2 forward units cut off on exposed slopes. On June 12, Mariners of the 1st Division's 7th Regiment launched a pre-dawn assault on Kunishi Ridge, seizing a foothold by surprise but finding themselves isolated almost immediately, surrounded by Japanese fighting from tunnels beneath their own captured ground, and only armoured vehicles could bring up ammunition and carry out the wounded under fire. 2 days later, on June 14th, the 1st Marine Regiment turned its attention to Yuza-Dake itself, grinding forward against defenders who understood that this ground was among the last Japan had left to lose, and who fought accordingly, with a desperation that made every cave clearance, every ridge crest, a fight to the death. For 6 days, the battle for Yuza Peak ground on, infantry working in small teams with flamethrowers and explosive charges to seal caves one by one, because there was no other way to clear coral honeycombed with tunnels too deep and too well braced for artillery to crack open from above. Then, on June 16, 1945, 80 years before this telling, Yuza-Dake fell. American troops finally stood atop the peak that had cost them so dearly, and for the first time looked south across the last 8 square miles of contested Okinawa, a vista of broken hills with nowhere left for Ushijima's army to retreat. It was not a clean victory, it was simply the moment one ridge among many finally went silent while fighting, continued across Hill 95 and the linked Yuza-Dake escarpment, and would rage for several more days at Hill 153 and Hill 115 before the southern line could be called secure. The human cost of these final weeks was staggering and strangely invisible to a public back home already celebrating victory in Europe, where VE Day had come and gone 4 weeks earlier. Okinawa shield bonus, African take army losses from the entire campaign would eventually total over 49,000 battle casualties, with tens of thousands more lost to combat fatigue, disease, and the punishing physical toll of 3 months under fire, making Okinawa the costliest single battle of the entire Pacific War for the United States. Japanese losses were almost incalculable by comparison, well over 100,000 military dead, and a civilian catastrophe layered atop the military one, as tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians, caught between two armies and subjected to propaganda warning of unspeakable American atrocities, died in the crossfire or by their own hand in scenes of mass suicide that remain among the most haunting chapters of the entire war. General Buckner himself would not live to see the campaign's end, killed by Japanese artillery fire on June 18th, just 2 days after Yuza-Dake fell, becoming the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire during the entire war. General Ushijima and his chief of staff would take their own lives by ritual suicide on June 22nd, as American forces overran his final headquarters cave near Hill 89, bringing organized resistance on Okinawa to its end. Though scattered fighting and the agonizing work of clearing remaining caves continued for days afterward, the fall of Yuza-Dake on June the 16th was never going to make headlines the way Iwo Jima's flag-raising had. It was simply one grim, vital piece of a closing vice, a single hill among the last Japan had left to defend, taken at a cost that, multiplied across every ridge and cave of southern Okinawa, would convince American military planners that an invasion of the Japanese home islands themselves could cost casualties on a scale almost too terrible to calculate, a calculation that would weigh heavily in the decisions made in Washington only weeks later. Today, Yuza-Dake stands quiet, reclaimed by green hillside, its coral caves sealed or collapsed, visited mostly by historians and the descendants of those who fought and died there, a place where, for 6 days, in June of 1945, ordinary young men on both sides paid an extraordinary price for ground that history would remember, if it remembered at all, as just one more hill on the long road to a war's ending.